You were a mistake the moment you set foot in this family." The words landed like a blade. Aurelia felt them slice through the quiet of the Hawthorne foyer and settle under her ribs. She clutched her stomach without meaning to, as if the tiny life inside might somehow steady the ground beneath her. Her hands trembled. The suitcase in Pierce's grip trembled. The house did not. Miranda Hawthorne's face was a study in cold satisfaction. She had crossed the room as if the floor were hers by right, as if every polished surface and gilded frame owed her obedience. Pierce stood beside her, jaw tight, eyes avoiding Aurelia's. There had been a time when those eyes had heated her like summer sun. Now he looked through her, past her, as if she were no more than a shadow to be swept away. "I cannot do this anymore," Pierce said finally, with the flatness of someone reading a script he had practiced. He shoved a small bag into Aurelia's hands and did not wait for her to protest. "You are putting pressure on the family. On me." Aurelia's breath came quick and shallow. She had prepared dinner that night, rosemary chicken, a pie she had practiced twice because Pierce liked the crust flaky and the filling tart. She had wanted, for one evening, to make the house feel like home. Instead, she had been handed a verdict. "You will leave," Miranda said. "Take your things and go. Do not bring scandal upon us." Pierce's hand grazed hers for a fraction of an instant, a ghost of the warmth that once kept her awake. He did not pull her close. He did not argue. He only stepped aside and let the world close the door behind her. The gate clanged. The sound echoed into the street and into Aurelia's chest. The sky above the Hawthorne estate was clear and cruel, white as bone. She stood on the curb, the small bag heavy in her palm, the life inside her heavy in a different, quieter way. Neighbors peered from behind curtains. A car passed, its driver a brief, impassive witness. The house that had been her shelter for 2 years now looked like a polished lie. She walked. The first step was the worst. The second was raw. The third felt like learning to breathe all over again. Her feet carried her along avenues she had once considered part of someone else's future. She passed the bakery, where Pierce used to bring warm rolls at dawn, the park where lovers left graffiti carved with promises they could not keep. Strangers watched her as if she were a spectacle. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable at the sight of a pregnant woman with nowhere to go. No one offered help. The sun was high and unforgiving by the time hunger gnawed loud enough to make her dizzy. The bag on her arm contained a few dresses, a small bundle of photographs, the silver locket Pierce's grandmother had given her at a wedding that felt like a lifetime ago. Nothing to build a life on. Nothing to hold back the chill creeping up her spine. At night she slept under an awning near a market, the city breathing around her in the way of a living thing. Rain came and went. It cooled the air and soaked her thin blanket. She woke with a cough, her ribs sore from walking. She learned to wedge her swollen feet into shoes that were a size too small because there was no other choice. The city's edges are merciless and precise. The people who live in them learn quickly how to make a life of small, careful things. Aurelia had only the instinct to protect the life growing inside her. On the third day the heat was so intense the air shimmered above the asphalt. She moved slowly, one foot in front of the other, hands already forming the habit of cradling her belly. She kept telling herself it was temporary. She kept telling herself Pierce would regret it. She kept telling herself the baby would be safe. Each repetition felt like a fragile charm she could not afford to let crack. She rounded a block she had avoided earlier because the alleyways there smelled of oil and old fire. The street was mostly deserted. A rusty dumpster leaned on its side like an afterthought. A plastic contractor's sack had been left beside it, its black skin torn and weathered by sun. For a second, she meant to step around it. Then the corner of something, metal, perhaps the glint of a zipper, caught the light and slid into view. She crouched without thinking. Knees protesting, she pushed at the sack's thin plastic. It crinkled, a sound like paper being read aloud. Inside was a smaller bag, heavy and honest in the way that money sometimes feels in stories she had once believed would never be hers. She zipped it, the metal teeth making a tiny staccato noise. Aurelia's vision narrowed, the world funneling down to the single thought that the bag might contain food. It was an ordinary hope. She unzipped the case with fingers that shook and expected the small comforts that might keep her alive for another few days. Instead, the world rearranged itself. Stacks upon stacks of bills lay neat and banded, the faces of strangers staring out in monochrome certainties. She blinked. The bills were thicker than any she had ever seen. She pulled one free with a trembling fingertip. The paper was crisp and clean, stamped with numbers and symbols that meant something enormous. $5 million. Her knees gave. Aurelia sank back on her heels, the baby in her belly jabbing a sharp, confused kick as if to say, "How dare you alter this quiet?" She felt the air leave her with the weight of it all, the humiliation of the last days, the coldness of Pierce's hand, Miranda's eyes, the endless small cruelties of being judged by an inheritance she didn't share. Behind her, a truck rumbled by and drowned out the creak of the dumpster's lid. No one watched. No one came. The city, in that odd mercy, continued turning. Aurelia looked at the money again. It sat like a promise and like a danger. She thought of the shelter's warm bowl she had washed for the Hawthornes when she first moved in. She thought of the way Pierce had once traced the outline of her face with a thumb and called it home. She thought of how the baby inside her might need a roof more than a name or a story. The rational part of her, trained by years of not getting what she needed, by avoiding trouble, by counting pennies and expectations, spoke softly with a voice of careful conscience. "This is not yours. This is trouble. Return it. Find help. Tell someone." The other voice, small and fierce as a hidden ember, whispered back, "This is a lifeline." She zipped the case closed with a decisive motion, the sound like the end of hesitation. The bag was heavy in her arms when she lifted it, the strap pressed into her palm. For the first time in days, something like clarity arrived. She would not let the world decide who she would be anymore. If fate had offered this fractured gift, she would accept it. She would not ask permission. Aurelia wrapped the case in the torn plastic, lifted it carefully, and slung it over her shoulder. The effort sent a shock through her back, a reminder of how fragile everything still was. She walked away from the dumpster with the slow, steady steps of someone who had made a choice. Each footfall was deliberate, each breath measured. Behind her, the alley receded into the ordinary ache of the city. Ahead, the road unraveled in a way that felt both terrifying and possible. The sun beat down, and the baby inside her kicked once, hard, as if approving the impossible. She paid for the smallest room she could find with the first bundle of bills, the motel clerk barely glancing at the cash as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old perfume. A thin curtain trembled with every breeze that found its way through the cracked window. For the first time in days, Aurelia lay down on a mattress that did not creak and closed her eyes without listening for footsteps behind her. Night moved around her like a soft animal. The baby shifted inside her with an impatient nudge, reminding her that whatever came next would not be decided by other people. She cut her hair with a pair of cheap scissors she found in the bathroom drawer. The mirror on the wall caught the motion in a way that made her feel like a stranger performing a ritual. Locks fell into the basin, then into the sink, then into the trash. Shorter hair made her face look harder, less exposed. She pinched the locket from around her neck and slid it into her pocket. Not to throw away, but to hide a past she did not want traced back to her. She practiced a new name on the pillow until it tasted familiar, Arden Vale. Arden took the bus to a part of the city she had never seen, where buildings leaned close together like gossiping relatives. She rented a tiny room above a bakery. The landlady, a woman who mended torn stockings while she spoke, asked no questions. Arden learned to keep her eyes on the floor and her hands busy. She found work washing dishes in a diner on the corner, the kind of place where morning sunlight made spilled coffee look like a promise. The work was honest and endless, steam fogging the windows, plates clattering like a small, steady drum. She kept her belly tucked beneath an apron and told the owner, a blunt man named Hank, that she needed the job for extra pay. He never checked her paperwork. The money she had taken felt heavy in a different way now, not just because of its weight, but because each pile of bills was a choice. At night, alone in her room, she counted and recounted the bundles until the numbers became a lullaby and a threat. The practical voices argued, "Return it, you will be hunted, you will be found." The quieter, fiercer voice whispered back, "Build, protect, heal." When she gave birth, it was the kind of hush that follows a storm. The hospital was small and smelled of lemon disinfectant and boiled sugar from the vending machine. A kind nurse, named Rosa held her hand and did not flinch at the crude wrappers of bills Arden kept folded inside her purse. The labor was a white fire. Pain sharpened everything into focus. She remembered Miranda's voice, Pierce's avoidance, the white marble of the Hawthorne foyer, and something fierce and tender gathered inside her. Solomon came with a sound like a promise. They laid him on her chest, and he blinked, slow and perfect, as if beginning a life that was only his to shape. The name felt right as it left her lips, Solomon, meaning peace. She watched him breathe and thought about the strange gift that had led to this room, this child. Guilt rose like foam sometimes. She imagined the people who had lost that money and the ripple of consequences she could not fully understand. But when she looked at Solomon's tiny fists curling against her finger, she folded that guilt close and turned it into fuel. She would make this right by making something honest and beautiful out of what she had. Weeks blurred into a steady sequence of small victories. With a portion of the money, she secured a derelict building on a narrow street that smelled of frying onions and laundry soap. It had been vacant for years. Windows were boarded, paint peeled like old scabs. People looked at it and only saw ruin. Arden watched it and saw shelter. She painted the front a warm, unfussy color. She put up a sign she could barely afford that read Roselight Haven. The name was her pledge, a place where light could come back to people who had been burned by life. She took in a woman who had a fever and no coat, a teenager who had been kicked out for being pregnant, an elderly woman whose hands shook with hunger. She cooked stew in a pot that burned the bottom if left unattended, and she learned to listen in the way someone listens to a child learning to say its first word. The shelter filled with small noises, children's laughter, the clatter of bowls, the whispered exchange of names and stories. Each person she fed became a quiet ledger against the emptiness she once felt. Arden never stopped saving receipts and hiding the larger bundles in places that felt safe, behind a loose floorboard, inside hollowed-out pages of library books, beneath a loose brick in the fireplace. The money was a secret she guarded like a pulse. She kept portions aside to pay the rent, to buy blankets, to fix the leak in the roof that came with every hard rain. She bought a second-hand stove that sputtered on cold mornings but warmed the shelter's kitchen, and she found a woman who knew how to mend clothing for the price of dinner and an hour's conversation. The town began to recognize Roselight Haven not as a curiosity but as a constant. People who needed it walked through the door and found a place where no one asked about their past. Still, there were nights when Arden sat by the window and watched the street empty, and the moon cut a thin path across the pavement, and the old, uneasy voice returned. How long before the past finds you? How long before someone pieces the day together and unravels everything? She had a stack of newspapers tucked in a drawer, and sometimes she read about white-collar thefts and luxury scandals with no knowledge of how closely those reports brushed against her own life. She learned to keep distance, to keep routine. She learned to be careful with whom she trusted. Yet she never hid the truth from the women in her care about what had brought them Roselight Haven. She told them that sometimes survival asks us to choose hard things, and that life does not offer tidy moral charts. She taught them to cook and to read, and to balance a ledger. She taught them to measure hope not by lofty promises, but by whether a child had a blanket at night and a warm bowl at dawn. On the outside, Arden wore a quiet plainness, an apron stained with tomato and flour, a face lined with the kind of small, resilient smiles that come from people who keep going. Inside, she held a city of calculations and possibilities, balancing what she owed to herself and what she owed to the strangers who now depended on her. There were nights she barely slept, hands clasped around a mug of tea while Solomon slept fitfully in the room beside her. There were days when Miranda's voice rose in her head like a storm, and days when Pierce's shadow felt long and cold. And there were moments when a woman at Roselight would curl into a chair and call her mama for the first time, and then the world made sense in a way it never had before. Arden had made a choice to take the bag from the alley, but she had transformed that act into something that no single person could own. The money had begun as a dangerous secret, and through the slow work of tending, it had become a seed for a life that honored the child she had carried, the women she sheltered, and the fierce, unquiet heart that refused to be small. The theft that had once loomed like a storm on the horizon had been turned, in her hands, into a roof and a stove, and a place where small lives could begin again. She did not feel absolved, but she felt, Finally, like she was building. The bell over Roselight Haven's door chimed like a small alarm mid-morning, a bright sound that usually meant a newcomer seeking a blanket or a cup of stew. Arden looked up from the ledger she had been filling with a pencil whose eraser had long since worn away. A child at the table was stabbing at alphabet soup and making a tiny, glorious mess. The shelter hummed with ordinary life, someone humming an old hymn while mending a shirt, another woman teaching a child to braid hair. It was the kind of noise that stitched days together and made the house feel like something more than four cracked walls. Then the door opened fully and the room's air shifted. Arden watched the woman who entered the way someone watches weather change, a slow, involuntary assessment. Miranda Hawthorne stood in the doorway, soaked from rain in a coat that was once expensive. Her throat worked. Her hair had begun to gray at the temple, and there were hollows under her eyes that had not been there the last time Arden had seen her. She did not look like a threat. She looked like someone stripped of every comfort. There was a fragility that made the children stop playing, and the mending needle hover mid-stitch. For a second Arden felt the old reflex. Step back, protect the shelter, do not let her past leak into the present. Then she rose from the ledger and met Miranda's gaze. Arden, Miranda said, and the name slid from her lips like a plea. Her voice trembled in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Please, I need to speak with you. Arden could have shut the door and walked away. She could have had someone sit Miranda down for tea and kept the distance that years of pain afford. Instead, she unlocked the back room and motioned for her to sit. The women of the shelter exchanged glances but offered no commentary. They had come to trust Arden's judgment about who to welcome and who to shelter from the rain. Miranda's hands shook as she folded them in her lap. She looked less like the matriarch who had once cornered Aurelia in a foyer and more like a woman who had been surprised by an avalanche. When she spoke, it was in fragments at first, like someone attempting to reconstruct a memory. It started with a phone call, she said. From the bank. From lawyers. From people who used to owe favors. Pierce, he's missing. The accounts. Every account has been drained. There are inquiries. There is talk of embezzlement. They asked questions about a withdrawal, about a transfer of $5 million. I came here because I thought of you. Arden felt her mouth dry. She refused to let her face betray her. You're telling me your family is in trouble, she said. Her voice was measured, the kind of voice she used when settling disputes over soup bowls and shared beds. You want help? Miranda's eyes filled with tears that did not reach the edges. We were stupid. We thought silence could fix things. We thought if we ignored it long enough, it would go away. Seraphine vanished. Pierce, he left notes, She stopped as if the words themselves were dangerous. They are looking for him. They are looking for us. The shelter seemed to lean in. A child dropped a spoon, the sound dull in the hush. Arden thought of the rusted dumpster, and the black contractor's sack, of the metal zipper, and the way the bills had looked like a scaled-down city in her lap. She thought of how the money had felt when she slipped it into the motel drawer, at once miraculous and perilous. She had told herself then that she would use it to build something that could not be bought back with threats or apologies. Miranda's hands reached for Arden's as if the two crossed worlds could be bridged by touch alone. They said the withdrawal happened around the time you left. They asked where the money went. If you have it, if you used it, we could save Pierce from being accused. We can make amends, Arden. Please. For the family. For what you once were. Arden's fingers tightened. The women at the tables looked down at their bowls. An elderly woman, who had been silent for days, stood and refilled a cup of tea with hands that had steadied through hard years. The shelter smelled of oatmeal and detergent and the faint metallic tang of coins tucked in jars for charity. It smelled like decisions. There was a long list of things Arden could say. She could recite the law as if it were a shield. She could point out that the money was not hers legally, that returning it might be the right thing in a courtroom full of men who liked to pretend that the poor understood their rules. She could hand over the ledger of receipts that tied each small renovation and each jacket mended to the money she had spent, and watch as the paperwork became an instrument of indictment. Instead, Arden remembered the faces that had arrived at her door broken, and without a story anyone believed. She remembered Ruth, who had been forced out of her house during a winter and who had learned to grow tomatoes on a windowsill. She remembered a teenager named Keisha who had learned to read and found her confidence in the margin notes of a paperback novel. She thought of Solomon's small fingers wrapping around her thumb, and of how sleep emptied her on some nights and filled her with purpose on others. "You think I took it," Miranda said, as if the thought was a physical accusation. "The timing. The ledger. We are desperate." Arden met her eyes, and saw not the old contempt but a woman who had run out of the usual defenses that shielded entitlement. Every line on Miranda's face was etched with regret, or perhaps with fear. "You're right in one sense," Arden said finally. Her voice carried the faint accent of someone who had once practiced apologies until they sounded like prayers. "I did take something from the street, but I did not take it to harm anyone. I took it because I was dying and the baby inside me needed a place to sleep and a bowl to be fed from. I used it to give women a place to go when life threw them out." Miranda's mouth trembled. "But my son, if he is arrested, then the law will run its course," Arden interrupted softly, not because she wanted to be cruel, but because the truth sits better when spoken plainly. "If Pierce committed a crime, justice will find its voice. If he is the victim of another person's betrayal, that will also come to light. I will not hand away a roof because your family made reckless choices." The words hung between them like a curtain that could be drawn back or left closed. Miranda's nails dug into the fabric of her coat. "You don't understand how things work. Money changes people. It hides things. 5 million. People will cut whatever threads they need to cut to protect themselves." "There is a difference between fear and action," Arden said. "Go to the police if you have questions. If you have proof that your son did not take part in criminal activity, present it. But do not come here asking me to undo what I built for the sake of a family that would let a pregnant woman sleep under an awning." A hush settled. Miranda's face folded into itself, the kind of expression a person has when they realize a truth that will not soften. She rose slowly, a motion like someone preparing to walk into a storm. "If you are asking me to leave you alone," she said, voice jagged, "then I will go. But know this, tyrannies crumble faster than they build. You may have shelter now, Arden, but shadows have long arms." Arden nodded, not out of surrender, but as the steady anchor of someone who had learned to bear more than allegations. "I will do what I must to protect these women," she said. "If your family is innocent, I will not obstruct that. But this shelter will not be dismantled for the sake of saving pride." Miranda paused at the threshold. For a moment, she looked like a woman who intended to say more, but the words failed her. She stepped outside and into the rain with a sudden briskness, as if to outrun the shame that had settled in her bones. The bell chimed once as she left. The room exhaled. The day moved on. Children laughed again. A new woman arrived with 2 small boys, and the suspicion that the world had nothing left to give her. Arden set another bowl on the table and poured stew. In the quiet that followed Miranda's departure, she sat at her ledger and wrote down an expense, a new lock for the back room, a small line item that felt like preparation. She taped up an envelope and slid it behind the false brick, where she kept the largest bundle of bills. Her hands did not shake. She had made a choice that would not be easy to live with, but it was hers. Later, when the sun folded itself into evening, she walked to the small yard and watched Solomon play with a string tied to a broken spool. The child's laugh was the clearest answer to anything the world might demand of her. Arden understood that the coming days would be full of hard questions. She also understood that answers would be found in the steady work of keeping a roof over the heads of women who had nowhere else to go. She had chosen a life that asked for courage every morning. Now she braced herself, not with fear but with the steady, ferocious calm of someone who knew the value of what she had made. Pierce Hawthorne's arrival came like a rupture. He stumbled into Roselight Haven mid-afternoon, rain streaking the collar of his coat, as if the weather itself had decided to wash him clean or reveal him. He looked older than the last time Arden had seen him in the foyer, gaunter, his suit rumpled, his eyes raw with panic. For a moment he simply stood in the doorway and let the room take him in. The patched curtains, the mismatched chairs, the children drawing chalk suns on a battered table. The sight seemed to unmoor something inside him. He blinked as if expecting to find a different scene, one that might absolve him without consequence. Arden set down a ladle and met him where she always met the world now, steady, unflinching. The women and the children turned, Curiosity, tempered by the safe habit they had of protecting each other. Solomon, playing with a spool of string on the floor, watched his father with a fascination that had not yet learned to read the past. Arden, Pierce breathed, the name tasting half like a prayer and half like an accusation. He stepped toward her with a kind of desperate grace. Please, you don't understand. Listen, it wasn't supposed to happen this way. Seraphine, she left with everything. She seized the accounts. I didn't know. I swear I didn't orchestrate. Arden folded her arms, the motion small but absolute. She had learned to measure compassion by the steadiness it produced in others. Pierce's hands shook. His voice rasped with the kind of honesty that arrives stripped of excuses. People are looking for the money, he said. They are looking for answers. They say the withdrawal, the $5 million, happened right after you left. If you hand it back, if you return it, I will not be arrested. You can save us. The room seemed to tighten around the words. A child dropped a spoon, and it clattered like a warning. Arden's face did not betray the churn inside her. She thought of the motel room where she had first held the case, of the way the bills had felt like both a salvation and a threat. She had turned those stacks into a roof and a stove, and into the small daily mercies that fed strangers back into life. Each blanket, each repaired jacket, each bowl of warm soup had been a deliberate choice. You can leave, she said. Her voice was even, the cadence of someone who had rehearsed truth until it fit like a second skin. You can stand here and ask me to undo the life I built for other people because your pride cannot bear consequence. But I will not hand over what shelters mothers and children because your family cannot face the consequences of its own choices. Pierce's face crumpled in a way that left him raw. He sank onto a chair, the storm outside matching the storm inside him. Please, he whispered. I loved you once. I can't lose everything. I can't be broken like this. You broke it, Arden said softly, not to wound but to place the fact where it belonged. You closed the door on me when I needed you most. I did not take anything to hurt someone. I took what I needed to survive, and I turned it into a refuge. If crime has been committed, let the law unfold. If someone betrayed you, let them be found. But do not ask me to erase what I have made for the sake of your absolution. He rose as if to plead again, and in that moment the quiet was cleaved by the authoritative sound of voices outside and the metallic rasp of a badge through a locked door. Officers entered in pairs, not storming but with the heavy inevitability of procedures set in motion. A detective, sturdy and exhausted, presented a warrant and a list of charges aimed at Pierce. Embezzlement, conspiracy, failure to account. Questions that had once been whispered in boardrooms had become a script that read him as culpable. Pierce's mouth moved. He tried to argue, to lace a narrative of victimhood into his voice. The detectives listened with a professional patience that decayed the veneer of his pleas. They read him his rights with the indifferent clarity of those who had seen the same human dramas before. The proud man reduced to a list of accusations. You have the right to remain silent, one of the officers said. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Arden watched Pierce's hands curl. She felt a vast and complicated sympathy, small and human against the enormity of the consequences, but it did not wrench her from her resolve. The law had to do its work without her interference. If Pierce's guilt was proven, then justice would be served. If he had been used, then the truth would come out. Her role was not to shield him. They moved gently, professionally. Pierce's eyes met Arden's one last time, a flash of something like regret, or perhaps the pained recognition that the life he had once gently owned was no longer his to claim. They guided him out into the rain and toward a car waiting to take him into custody. He reached out as if to touch Solomon's head, but a detective stepped between father and child with a soft, necessary firmness. Solomon looked up, puzzled, and then returned to his spool of string. The world for him remained partial and tender, not yet layered with the complexity of adult betrayals. After the car left, the shelter exhaled. Plates resumed their small clinking. Someone mended the coat Pierce had shrugged off. The women moved through routines that had become armor. Arden sat at the kitchen table and watched the sun break through clouds like an answer. Her hands had learned to keep calm through crises in a way that felt like a muscle grown from necessity. Miranda returned a week later. This time she carried her apology like an offering. Her voice was low and nearly shameful. She did not ask for immediate restoration. She did not expect it. She had come to offer what apologies can offer, acknowledgement and a hope for forgiveness. "I was cruel," she said simply as they stood in the quiet office. "We were cruel. I cannot undo it. I can only ask that you know I would change if I could. Pierce, he got lost in things I did not know. I turned away when he needed help because I thought protecting the family meant preserving its image. I was wrong." Arden listened. Forgiveness did not arrive as a single grand motion. It was the slow unwrapping of an old knot. She thought of the women in the house who would be affected if Miranda returned and caused upheaval. She thought of Solomon's small hand in hers, the steady beat of the life they had nurtured. "I forgive you," she said finally, words that carried a weight neither light nor absolute. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. You cannot ask to return to a place you helped destroy simply because circumstances make you vulnerable. We will not become a refuge for the past that refuses to accept change. If you want to help, do it without expectation. Help feed the children. Help mend the jackets. Do not ask to step back into a life you once helped break. Miranda's face folded with relief and the ache of true contrition. She took a position volunteering in the kitchen a few hours each week. She learned to chop onions without thinking of the Hawthorne table. She learned the economy of small acts that do not ask for recognition. Months later, news arrived about Seraphine Vereen. The mistress, who had vanished with luxuries and forged documents, had been captured attempting to cross a border with false papers. Her arrest did not erase the damage. It only clarified the lines of culpability. Investigations revealed that Seraphine had orchestrated transfers and used Pierce's access to divert funds. The legal process moved like a slow, inevitable tide. Pierce's charges were reviewed, his statements weighed against the ledgered evidence. In the end, the courts found complex culpability. Truth was messy, but it emerged, and with it a measure of accountability for those who had engineered deception. As the legal storm subsided, Roselight Haven settled into a steadier rhythm. Funding from a small anonymous donor arrived, perhaps routed by a conscience stirred by stories of rescue. Arden used it to replace the roof and to buy a sturdier stove. She expanded the shelter's hours and hired a counselor for the women and children who bore scars that did not fade with time. Solomon began to find friends his age and learn to run without fear. There were afternoons when Arden would stand at the doorway and just watch. Children leaping over puddles, an older woman teaching knitting to a teenager, Miranda carrying a tray of bread with tentative grace. The noise in the house was no longer only survival, it had become a chorus. Arden understood that what she had built was not owed to a single moment of theft or to a single desperate decision. It had been forged from persistence, from small consistent kindnesses, from the courage to keep doors open when society would have shut them. One evening, as the sun melted gold across the courtyard, Solomon climbed into her lap and pressed his face into her hair. Arden held him close and felt, for the first time in a long while, a quiet satisfaction that belonged not to triumph but to a life tended well. The world would always carry shadows. It would always hand difficult choices to those who could least afford them. But under this roof, with steady hands and open hearts, a small community had learned to answer those choices with courage. Arden thought of the alley where the contractor's sack had once sat, of the glint of a zipper, and the way a single decision had split her life into before and after. She did not pretend the past had no cost. She only held the present as proof that something different could be made out of pain. The shelter's lights glowed as twilight settled, and the house pulsed with the quiet certainty of people who had refused to be broken.